There is a specific kind of cold that stays with you for the rest of your life. It's not the kind of cold caused by winter weather or a drafty room. It's the icy realization that the people who brought you into this world, the people who were supposed to protect you from the harshness of reality, are actually the ones pushing you out into it. When I was 16 years old, my parents stood on the porch of our cramped suburban home, tossed a single black trash bag onto the wet driveway, and locked the door behind me. My father's final words to me weren't an apology. They weren't even spoken with anger. He just looked at me with deep, exhausting apathy and said, "Honestly, Leo, we've never really had the space or the money for you anyway. Julian is our future. You're just a liability. Get out." 12 years later, I found myself standing in the darkened control room of a multi-million-dollar architectural estate that I built with my own two hands. I wasn't cold anymore. The house was perfectly climate-controlled, nestled high on a cliffside overlooking a deep forest lake. But as I looked at the glowing bank of monitors in front of me, a familiar numbness washed over my chest. On the live, high-definition security feed, two men in dark hoodies were pacing around my back patio. One of them held a heavy steel crowbar. The other was wielding a pair of industrial bolt cutters. Through the pixelated digital feed, even with their hoods pulled low, I recognized them instantly. They were my sister's husbands, Mark and Todd. They thought they were being clever. They thought they were sneaking into an abandoned vacation home to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. They thought that because they had cut the main fiber optic line at the edge of my property, the house was blind and deaf. What they didn't know was that this house was a fortress. It ran on an independent, solar-powered cellular backup system. Every breath they took, every scraping sound of their boots against my slate tile, was being streamed in crystal-clear 4K directly to my phone and to the local state trooper dispatch desk 15 miles away. I didn't yell. I didn't rush to my car to confront them. I just pulled up a leather chair, poured myself a glass of water, and watched the live feed. I watched my family prepare to destroy themselves, and for the first time in 12 years, I smiled. If you want to understand how a family gets to the point where they break into their own blood relative's home, you have to understand the anatomy of a lie. You have to understand how a golden child can systematically ruin a sibling's life, and how parents will gladly blind themselves to the truth if the lie is easier to swallow. Growing up, our house on Elm Street always felt tight. It was a standard 3-bedroom, 1.5-bath split level that had seen better days. The paint was peeling in the corners, the plumbing constantly groaned, and the air was always thick with a subtle underlying tension. But the lack of physical space wasn't the real issue. The real issue was the lack of emotional space. In our family, all the air in the room was reserved for my older brother, Julian. Julian was what people call a charismatic parasite. From the time he was a toddler, he knew exactly how to flash a smile to get out of trouble. If Julian crashed his bicycle into the neighbor's garage, it was because the neighbor had parked awkwardly. If Julian failed a history test, it was because the teacher had a personal vendetta against him. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor, bought into it completely. They didn't just love Julian, they worshipped the idea of him. He was the athlete, the popular kid, the one who was going to put our family name on the map. I, on the other hand, was Leo, the quiet one, the afterthought. I spent most of my time in a converted walk-in closet in the basement that my dad had thrown a twin mattress into, calling it a bedroom. I didn't mind the small space, honestly. It was the only place in the house where I didn't have to listen to my parents praising Julian for doing the bare minimum, while completely ignoring my straight A's or my part-time job at the local library. My sisters, Chloe and Sarah, quickly learned how the household dynamic worked. They realized early on that aligning themselves with Julian meant scraps of my parents' favor. If Julian wanted the TV, Chloe and Sarah would back him up. If Julian wanted the last piece of cake, they'd argue that he deserved it because he had a big game coming up. I learned to become invisible. I kept my head down, saved every penny from my library shifts, and planned my escape for the day I turned 18. But Julian wouldn't let me leave in peace. He needed a scapegoat, and as we entered high school, his habits became incredibly expensive. By the time Julian was 18 and I was 16, he had fallen in with a dangerous crowd. He wasn't just skipping classes anymore. He was gambling. It started with small poker games in local basements, but within a year, he was running up heavy debts with local bookies who didn't care that he was just a suburban kid with a nice smile. They wanted their money, and they were starting to show up outside our house in unmarked cars. One Tuesday evening, the tension in the house snapped. My father had been working overtime shifts at the logistics plant for 2 years to save up $15,000 in cash. It was his dream fund. He wanted to buy a small box truck and start his own independent delivery route, finally breaking free from his miserable corporate boss. He kept the cash in a heavy manila envelope locked inside the bottom drawer of his metal filing cabinet in the den. I was sitting in the basement, typing out a history essay on a clunky, second-hand computer, when I heard a violent crash from upstairs. I ran up the steps to find my father standing in the middle of the den, his face completely pale, his hands shaking. The bottom drawer of the filing cabinet had been pried open with a flathead screwdriver. The manila envelope was gone. $15,000, the family's entire future, had vanished. My mother was hysterically crying on the sofa, clutching her chest. Chloe and Sarah were standing in the doorway, whispering in hushed, panicked tones. And then Julian walked through the front door. He didn't look surprised. He looked calculated. He took one look at the scene, ran over to my father, and grabbed his shoulders. "Dad, what happened? Is everyone okay?" My father could barely speak. "The money, Julian. Someone broke the lock. It's gone." Julian immediately turned his head toward me. His eyes narrowed, and a terrifyingly convincing expression of shock and disappointment washed over his face. No. Tell me you didn't, Leo." I froze. "What? Tell you I didn't what?" "Dad," Julian said, turning back to my father, his voice cracking with theatrical emotion. "I didn't want to say anything because he's my brother, but lately, Leo's been acting incredibly strange. I went into the basement yesterday to borrow a textbook, and I saw him hiding a bunch of cash under his mattress. I asked him where he got it, and he told me to mind my own business or he'd screw me up. I thought he was just selling weed or something. I didn't think he'd do this to you." The room went entirely silent. Every single pair of eyes in that room locked onto me. "He's lying!" I shouted, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Dad, I've been downstairs all night. I haven't touched your office. Julian is making this up." But my father didn't listen. He pushed past me, his heavy work boots thudding down the basement stairs. We all followed him. He marched straight to my tiny closet bedroom, ripped the blankets off my twin mattress, and flipped it over. There, tucked neatly between the box spring and the fabric, were 3 crisp, bound stacks of $100 bills, exactly $3,000. My breath caught in my throat. I looked at Julian, who was standing in the back of the room, looking down at the floor with a fake expression of profound grief. But for a split second, just as our eyes met, he raised his gaze and gave me a tiny, slow smirk. He had stolen the $15,000 to pay off his bookie, kept $3,000 back to plant under my bed, and used me as the perfect shield. "Dad, please," I begged, tears finally spilling over my eyes. "Look at the lock on the cabinet. It was pried open with a tool. I don't even know where the tools are kept. Julian did this. You have to believe me." My mother let out a sharp, disgusted shriek. "How dare you? How dare you steal your father's dream and then try to blame your older brother? Julian has done nothing but protect you your entire life." Chloe stepped forward, her face twisted in anger. "I knew it. He's always been creepy, lurking down here in the dark. He's probably the one who's been stealing packages off the neighbors' porches, too." Within an hour, Julian's frame job had expanded. He text-blasted half our high school, telling everyone that I was a thieving junkie who had ruined our family. By the next morning, my entire world had collapsed. My father didn't call the police, not because he wanted to protect me, but because he couldn't bear the public embarrassment of having a thief for a son. Instead, he walked down to the basement with a heavy black lawn bag. He began ripping my clothes out of the small plastic dresser, shoving them inside. "Dad, stop! Please listen to me!" I cried, grabbing his arm. He whipped around, his eyes completely bloodshot, filled with a terrifying, cold rage. He shoved the trash bag into my chest so hard I stumbled backward onto the mattress. "I don't want to hear another word out of your mouth, Leo," he said, his voice dangerously low. "We have worked ourselves to the bone to provide for this family, and you repay us by gutting my future? Honestly, we've never really had the space or the money for you anyway. Julian is our future. You're just a liability. Get out of my house." My mother stood at the top of the stairs, her arms crossed, watching me carry my entire life in a plastic bag. She didn't move to hug me. She didn't say goodbye. As I walked out the front door into the brisk autumn air, I heard the heavy deadbolt click into place behind me. When you are 16 years old and homeless, the world changes shape. It ceases to be a place of possibilities and becomes a series of immediate threats. That first night, I slept under a concrete picnic shelter at a local county park, using my trash bag of clothes as a pillow. The plastic crinkled every time I moved, a constant, noisy reminder of exactly how low I had fallen. I didn't sleep more than 20 minutes at a time. Every rustle of leaves, every distant car engine made my stomach violently knot up with panic. The next morning, I walked to school. I had to. It was the only place where I could wash my face in the sink and use a clean bathroom. But school was no longer a safe haven. Julian's rumors had spread like wildfire. When I walked down the hallway, people literally moved away from me, clutching their backpacks tighter, as if I were going to pickpocket them in broad daylight. My teachers looked at me with disappointment. I felt completely, utterly invisible. I knew I couldn't survive on the streets for long, so I made a choice. I walked into a local, greasy diner called the Silver Dollar, about 3 miles from the school. The owner was a gruff, elderly man named Sal, who looked like he hadn't smiled since 1984. I walked straight up to him at the counter and said, "I need a job. I'll wash dishes, I'll scrub the grease traps, I'll take out the trash. You don't even have to pay me minimum wage. Just let me sleep in the storage shed out back and give me 1 meal a day." Sal looked at me for a long, agonizing minute, chewing on an unlit cigar. He looked at my crumpled clothes, the dark circles under my eyes, and the sheer desperation radiating off me. Finally, he spat into a cup and nodded toward the kitchen. "Apron's in the back. Don't make me regret this, kid." For the next 2 years, my life was a grueling, relentless cycle of survival. I would wake up at 4:30 a.m. to prep the diner kitchen, walk to school, sit through 6 hours of classes while trying not to fall asleep at my desk, and then sprint back to the diner to work the dish pit until 11 p.m. Sal kept his word. He let me sleep on a cot in the dry storage shed behind the diner. In the winter, it was so cold my breath formed clouds inside the room. In the summer, the heat was suffocating. But it was mine. It was a space where nobody could accuse me of stealing, because I had absolutely nothing to take. I graduated high school at 18 with honors, despite everything. I didn't go to prom. I didn't have anyone cheering for me at graduation. Sal gave me a $50 bill and a handshake, which felt like $1 million compared to what my parents had given me. With my high school diploma in hand, I left the diner and moved to the nearest major city, renting a room in a dilapidated apartment with 4 other guys. I bought a heavily bruised, cracked-screen laptop at a pawn shop for $35. That laptop became my weapon. I realized early on that the only way out of the meat grinder of poverty was code. Software didn't care who my parents were. Software didn't care about Julian's lies. Software only cared if the logic was sound. I taught myself Python, SQL, and database architecture by watching free tutorials on public library Wi-Fi. I spent 18 hours a day staring at glowing green text on a black screen. I lived on instant ramen and tap water. My teeth ached from malnutrition, and my back ached from sleeping on a mattress I found next to a dumpster. But I didn't stop. Every line of code I wrote was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and the family that had abandoned me. By the time I was 24, I hit a breakthrough. I noticed that real estate investors were struggling to aggregate local zoning laws, historical tax data, and market trends into a single, cohesive interface. I spent 9 months building a specialized, automated data scraping and analytics tool called Zonely. I launched it with no expectations. Within 3 months, a mid-sized venture capital firm noticed the software. After a week of intense negotiations in a high-rise boardroom, where I felt completely out of place in my cheap, off-the-rack suit, they bought the rights to the architecture for $750,000 cash, plus a recurring percentage of future subscriptions. When the money cleared into my bank account, I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment and stared at the screen for 2 hours. I didn't celebrate. I didn't buy a sports car. The very first thing I did was hire a private investigator to look into my family. Not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I wanted to know where the landmines were. The investigator's report was fascinating. Predictably, Julian's golden future had completely evaporated. After I was kicked out, my parents had dumped every cent of their remaining savings, plus a massive second mortgage on their Elm Street house, into a local logistics and shipping company for Julian to run. They wanted him to be a CEO, but Julian didn't know how to work. He knew how to spend. Within 48 months, he had completely mismanaged the company, lost their primary contracts, and run the business into total bankruptcy. My parents were now drowning in nearly $200,000 of high-interest debt, desperately trying to pay off a mortgage they couldn't afford on a house that was falling apart. I closed the report, filed it away in a drawer, and decided to buy my peace. I bought a plot of land that was the exact opposite of Elm Street. It was isolated, quiet, and breathtaking. Located on a steep cliffside, 3 hours north of the city, surrounded by deep pine forests and looking out over a pristine lake. I hired an architect to build a modern, minimalist masterpiece: concrete, steel, and massive sheets of reinforced glass. I spent nearly $80,000 on the security infrastructure alone: automated steel gates at the bottom of the half-mile driveway, motion-activated perimeter lighting, and an independent closed-circuit cloud camera system that could read a license plate from 300 yards away in total darkness. It wasn't just a house. It was a physical manifestation of my safety. It was the fortress that ensured the chaos of my childhood could never, ever touch me again. For 2 years, I lived in total serenity. I ran my consultancy business from my home office, watched the sun rise over the lake every morning, and finally learned what it felt like to have a full stomach and a quiet mind. I thought the ghost of Leo on Elm Street was dead and buried, but the universe has a strange way of forcing a confrontation. In May of 2026, a regional business magazine ran a profile piece on young tech founders who had bypassed traditional Silicon Valley routes. They chose me as the cover feature. The photo shoot took place at my estate, showcasing the sharp angles of the house against the natural beauty of the cliffside. The headline read, "Out of the Shadows: How Leo Vance Built a Tech Empire from Nothing." I didn't think much of it. It was good press for my business. But I forgot that my sister Chloe still lived in the area, and that she spent a significant portion of her life sitting in waiting rooms, consuming local media. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping a cup of black coffee, when my phone began to vibrate violently against the stone countertop. It was an unknown number. Usually I ignore them, but the area code was familiar. It was the area code of my hometown. I picked it up, pressing it to my ear without speaking. "Leo? Is that really you?" The voice hit me like a bucket of ice water. It was my mother, Eleanor. It was the exact same voice that had shrieked at me in the basement 12 years ago, but now the venom was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a sickening, syrupy sweetness that made my stomach turn. "What do you want, Eleanor?" I said, my voice deadpan, completely devoid of emotion. There was a brief, sharp intake of breath on the other end. She was clearly thrown off by me using her first name, but she recovered quickly, letting out a forced, breathy laugh. "Oh, Leo, darling, don't be like that. We saw the magazine article. Oh my goodness, the house looks absolutely magnificent. Your father and I just sat there crying when we saw it. We are just so incredibly proud of you. We always knew you had that special spark in you." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the calm waters of the lake. "You always knew? Is that why you watched my dad throw my clothes into a garbage bag and tell me I was a liability?" "Oh, Leo, you have to understand," she said, her voice dropping into a manipulative, pleading whine. "We were under so much stress back then. We were misled. We were entirely misled by circumstances. Families go through hard times, but blood is thicker than water. We have to put the past behind us. We're in a terrible situation right now, Leo. The bank is threatening to foreclose on the house. Your father's health isn't good, and Julian's had some terrible luck with his business ventures." And there it was, the real reason for the phone call, the pitch. "Get to the point, Eleanor," I said. "Well," she cleared her throat, her tone shifting from pleading to a slightly more confident, entitled cadence. "We were talking as a family last night. Chloe, Sarah, Julian, and your father. Since you have that massive 5-bedroom estate all to yourself up there, and you're clearly making more money than you can ever spend, we think it's only fair that you help the family out. Julian needs a fresh start. He has a brilliant new business concept, but he needs collateral for a bank loan. We want you to sign the deed of your vacation estate over to Julian's name temporarily so he can secure the funding." I sat there, utterly stunned by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the request. They wanted me to give my fortress, the home I had bled for, to the person who had systematically destroyed my life. "And what if I don't want to do that?" I asked, testing the depths of her delusion. "Well, if that's too much trouble," she continued, completely missing the ice in my voice, "Chloe and Sarah had a wonderful idea. They want to take over the property during the peak summer months and run it as a luxury Airbnb destination. They've already looked up the rates for your area. They can get nearly $1,200 a night. They'll handle the cleaning, and they'll take 90% of the profit to help pay off our mortgage and Julian's debts. It's the perfect solution. It's your duty as a son to protect this family, Leo." A dark, heavy silence filled the line. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a strange sense of absolute clarity. The little boy who wanted their approval was completely dead. "Let me make this very clear to you, Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice calm, even, and razor-sharp. 12 years ago, you stood on your porch and told me that you had no space for me. You told me I was a liability. You threw me to the wolves and didn't care if I starved to death in a ditch. So hear me now. I have no space for you. I have no money for you. And I have absolutely no family on Elm Street. Do not call this number again." Before she could scream, I hung up the phone. I immediately blocked her number. Within 10 minutes, my father tried to call from his mobile. Blocked. Julian tried to call. Blocked. Chloe and Sarah tried to text me from their husbands' phones. Blocked and blocked. But entitled people do not handle rejection well. To an entitled person, a boundary feels like an act of violence. When they realized they couldn't access my wealth through manipulation, they decided to resort to psychological warfare. The next morning, Chloe and Sarah launched a coordinated, vicious smear campaign across Facebook and local community groups. They posted high-resolution screenshots of my estate from the magazine article, alongside photos of my aging parents looking frail and sad in their messy living room. The captions were sickeningly manipulative. "This is our millionaire brother, Leo Vance. He lives in a multi-million-dollar luxury fortress while his elderly, sick parents are facing homelessness due to bank foreclosure. He refuses to give them a single penny. He has blocked his entire family because he thinks he's too rich for us now. Please share this so the world knows the kind of monster he really is." Because it was a small town, the post went viral locally. People I hadn't seen in a decade began leaving horrific comments on my public business pages, calling me a greedy tech bro, a heartless sociopath, and a disgrace to the community. My attorney called me that afternoon, asking if I wanted to issue a cease and desist or file a defamation lawsuit. I looked out at the lake, watching a hawk circle high above the trees. "No," I told him. "Don't touch them yet. Entitled people always escalate when they don't get a reaction. Let them dig the hole a little deeper." That brings us back to that rainy Tuesday evening in May. I was staying at a high-end boutique hotel in the city, having just concluded a 3-day tech architecture conference. It was roughly 11:45 p.m. I was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed in my t-shirt and sweatpants, reviewing a set of database schemas, when my phone on the nightstand emitted a sharp, distinct, high-pitched chime. It was the priority alert from my estate's perimeter security grid. Zone 4, the rear lakeside patio. I picked up the phone and opened the secure app. The screen split into 4 high-definition night vision feeds. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the edges of the forest, but the camera's infrared illuminators cut through the dark perfectly. 2 figures were moving along the glass wall of my living room. They were wearing heavy winter jackets with the hoods pulled tight and thick work gloves. I zoomed in on the primary feed. The first man was tall, slightly heavyset, with a distinctive, clumsy gait. It was Mark, my sister Chloe's husband. He was holding a heavy steel crowbar. The second man was shorter, thick-necked, and pacing nervously. It was Todd, Sarah's husband. He was gripping a pair of heavy industrial bolt cutters. I watched as Todd walked over to the main utility riser on the side of my house. He raised the bolt cutters and snips the thick, armored fiber optic internet cable coming out of the ground. On the video feed, I saw him look up at Mark and give a thumbs up, clearly believing that they had just deactivated the house's nervous system. They had no idea that my entire security network was completely decentralized. The moment the fiber cable was cut, the system automatically routed its data stream through an encrypted solar-powered cellular uplink hidden inside the faux stone chimney stack on the roof. I didn't panic. My heart rate didn't even elevate. I tapped a pre-programmed macro button on my app labeled Emergency Dispatch. Because I paid a premium for private estate monitoring, the system instantly routed the live video feed and GPS coordinates directly to the state trooper barracks located just 12 miles down the mountain highway. A digital text box popped up on my screen. Troopers dispatched. Estimated arrival time, 9 minutes. Maintain distance. I sat back against the headboard of my hotel bed, propped my phone up against the lamp, and watched the show. On the screen, Mark raised the crowbar and slammed it violently into the bottom corner of the double-paned, tempered glass patio door. The glass didn't shatter into pieces, it was reinforced security glass, but it spiderwebbed into an opaque white sheet. Mark cursed, kicking the center of the door 3 times until the reinforced frame finally buckled inward with a muted, metallic crunch. They stepped into my dark living room, their muddy boots leaving heavy, dark tracks across my custom white oak floors. They unzipped large, empty canvas duffel bags. They were completely relaxed. They thought I was away for the week, and they thought the house was dark. They began moving through my space like kids in a candy store. Mark walked straight to my entertainment center, using the crowbar to violently rip a $10,000 OLED television and a custom audio receiver off the wall mounts, completely tearing the drywall in the process. Todd was in the kitchen, emptying my wine fridge into his bag, tossing high-end bottles of vintage scotch into the canvas sacks without a care in the world. They were smiling. At one point, Mark picked up a custom glass sculpture I had purchased in Italy, looked at it under his flashlight, laughed, and tossed it carelessly onto the sofa. They weren't just stealing. They were enjoying the act of defiling the space of the brother who had dared to say no to them. The digital clock on my phone screen read 11:53 p.m. 8 minutes had passed. Suddenly, through the wide glass windows of the living room, I saw faint, strobing reflections of red and blue light painting the pine trees at the edge of my driveway. 3 state trooper interceptors had navigated my private road with their sirens completely silent, their headlights turned off. Mark and Todd were so busy arguing over how to disconnect my home office computer that they didn't notice the front door being quietly breached. The next sequence of events happened with terrifying military precision. The living room was suddenly flooded with the blinding white light of high-intensity tactical flashlights. 4 troopers, shields raised and sidearms drawn, poured into the space. "State Police, hands on your heads! Face the ground, now!" The audio from the living room camera came through my phone's speaker crystal clear. Todd let out a high-pitched, terrified shriek, immediately dropping his canvas bag of stolen electronics and collapsing onto his stomach, screaming, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot! We're family! We have permission!" Mark froze, holding the crowbar in his right hand, looking like a deer caught in the high beams of a semi-truck. A trooper closed the distance instantly, kicking the crowbar out of his hand, sweeping Mark's legs out from under him, and slamming him face first into the muddy, glass-strewn hardwood floor. I watched as the troopers pulled their arms behind their backs, the metallic click-click-click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through my pristine, ruined home. They were dragged out into the pouring rain, their hoods falling back to reveal faces completely white with absolute, paralyzing terror. I closed the app, locked my phone, and went to sleep. At 8 a.m. the following morning, I pulled my car into the gravel parking lot of the state trooper barracks. The morning air was crisp and clear, the rain from the night before having washed the sky clean. The moment I stepped through the glass double doors of the lobby, I was met with absolute, chaotic noise. The waiting room was a complete family reunion. My mother Eleanor, my sister Chloe, my sister Sarah, and my brother Julian were all packed into the plastic chairs. Chloe and Sarah were hysterically sobbing, their makeup completely smeared down their faces. My mother was pacing back and forth, waving her hands wildly at an incredibly exhausted-looking desk sergeant. Julian was standing in the corner, looking agitated, typing furiously on his phone. The second Chloe saw me enter, her face transformed from grief into pure, unadulterated venom. She lunged across the room, her fingernails clawed out, shrieking so loudly the entire lobby went dead silent. "You psychotic, heartless monster!" she screamed, a trooper quickly stepping between her and me, holding his arm out to keep her back. "You set them up. You knew they were going up there. They were just looking at the house. They were just checking on your property for you. You ruined our lives. Drop the charges right now, Leo, or I swear to God I will kill you." My father wasn't there. He had apparently stayed in the car because his blood pressure was too high. But my mother stepped forward, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. "Leo, look at your sisters! Look what you are doing to this family," she commanded, trying to use her old parental authority voice. "Mark and Todd have jobs. They have reputations. They were just trying to find a way to help us run that Airbnb business we talked about. You will walk up to that desk right now, you will tell them it was all a big misunderstanding, and you will drop these ridiculous charges. If you don't do this, Leo, I swear to you, you are dead to this family. I will disown you forever." I stood there in the center of the lobby, my hands loosely in the pockets of my tailored wool coat. I looked at my mother. I looked at my sobbing sisters. And then I looked past them at Julian, who was trying to look intimidating from the back of the room. A soft, genuine laugh escaped my lips. It wasn't a bitter laugh. It was a laugh of pure, unburdened freedom. "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice conversational and clear so everyone in the room could hear every syllable. "You disowned me 12 years ago on a wet driveway on Elm Street. You can't disown someone who isn't yours. And let's be entirely accurate here. Mark and Todd didn't check on my property. They cut my utility lines, smashed my reinforced glass doors with a crowbar, and attempted to grand larceny over $40,000 worth of my personal property. They are currently being charged with felony burglary, conspiracy, and criminal destruction of property. I am signing every single formal complaint the state prosecutor puts in front of me," Sarah screamed, burying her face in Chloe's shoulder. Julian finally stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to play the protector role he had skated by on his entire life. "You think you're a big man now because you have some money, Leo?" Julian sneered, his voice shaking slightly. "You're a coward. We're your family. You owe us. Without us, you wouldn't have jack crap." I walked right up to Julian, standing just inches from his face. I looked down into his eyes, seeing the exact same petty, insecure bully who had stolen $15,000 and ruined his own brother's life because he couldn't pay off a bookie. "Actually, Julian," I whispered, my voice completely steady, "you are completely right. I owe you everything. If you hadn't been a thieving, manipulative snake, if you hadn't framed me and gotten me kicked out onto the street, I might have ended up just like you. I might have ended up a lazy, entitled, broke loser who relies on his aging parents to bail him out of every failure. You forged me into who I am today. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you." Julian's face went entirely red. He raised a fist as if he were going to strike me, but the trooper standing nearby immediately cleared his throat and rested his hand on his taser. Julian lowered his hand, trembling with humiliated rage. I walked up to the counter, took a sleek black pen from the desk sergeant, and calmly signed my name on the bottom of the formal felony complaints. Mark and Todd were denied bail later that afternoon due to the overwhelming, indisputable 4K video evidence of them planning and executing the break-in. They are currently awaiting trial, and according to my attorney, they are looking at a minimum of 3 to 5 years in a state penitentiary. But I wasn't finished. I am a programmer. I believe in closing every loop. I believe in fixing every duplicate entry in the system. The following Monday, I met with my corporate attorney in the city. I instructed him to look into the specific holding company that owned the secondary mortgage on my parents' house on Elm Street, the mortgage they were currently 3 months delinquent on. Using a newly registered anonymous LLC called Sanctuary Holdings, I authorized my attorney to approach the bank and purchase the debt packet entirely. For a cash payment of $165,000, I became the sole owner of my parents' mortgage note. I was officially their landlord. 2 weeks after Mark and Todd were processed into jail, a registered processor walked up the steps of Elm Street. He knocked on the door and handed my father Arthur an official, legally binding eviction notice. It wasn't from a faceless corporate bank. The header of the document clearly listed the corporate registry of Sanctuary Holdings LLC, with my name listed explicitly as the managing partner. They were given exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. My mother tried to call me from payphones, from her friends' phones, leaving crying, incoherent voicemails begging for mercy, promising that they would apologize to me on television if I just let them keep the house. I never answered. I simply forwarded the audio files to my attorney to log for potential harassment injunctions. On the final day of the eviction notice, I hired a private moving crew to secure the property. I didn't go there myself. I didn't need the theatrical satisfaction of watching them pack. But the foreman sent me a confirmation photo when the job was completed. The photo showed the Elm Street driveway. Sitting on the wet asphalt were several large black trash bags containing their clothes and belongings. The front door had a massive, heavy steel padlocked bar across it. My parents and Julian were forced to move into a cramped, dilapidated 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial south side of town, a place where the plumbing constantly groans and the walls are paper thin. The rent for that apartment is paid for entirely by Julian, who now works 45 hours a week at a minimum wage retail inventory job, finally learning what it feels like to work a dish pit. They wanted my house. They wanted to take my sanctuary and use it to fund their entitlement. Instead, they lost the very roof over their heads. Blood means absolutely nothing. It is a biological accident. Loyalty, respect, accountability, and love. Those are the things that make a family. If you cast someone out into the dark because you think they are a liability, do not be surprised when they build a fortress, lock the gates, and leave you out there to freeze.